You know, we are a lot more alike than we are different.
Right.
And what we begin to see and understand and realize is that there are some things that make relationships work, and there are some things that make relationships complicated.
Right.
And so what we're going to talk about today are the 3 Ps. These are 3 things that we see consistently in people that have a hard time connecting and building healthy relationships.
And we're going to be talking about that next on this episode of the Rich Relationship Podcast with Gil and Renee.
Stay tuned.
Welcome to the Rich Relationship Podcast with Gil
and Renee, where amazing things happen. Our goal is to help build, repair, and restore healthy relationships.
Our primary focus is on the marriage relationship. However, the topics are applicable to the relationships that we value most. Remember, we're stronger together.
Let's grow.
You know, you started talking about the 3 Ps, but we never said what they were.
I know we did that on purpose.
So you going to share with people what the 3 Ps are now, or are we just going to just jump into it and start talking about it?
No, we should tell them what they are.
Okay.
So the 3 Ps are pride, prideful, and proud.
Pride, prideful, and being proud.
Yes.
So what made you come up with this? I know you said we kind of talked. I know in the couples that we've worked with and talked
being private, proud, and prideful. Those are the things that we have kind of recognized that when couples or individuals struggle with any one or all 3 of those, it makes it very difficult for them, or it makes it difficult for relationships to blossom and to really flourish. And so we want to really kind of unpack, because being private is not a bad thing.
No, it's normal.
However, when you're private to the point that you don't let people in, then that's what makes being private a bad thing.
You know, that's kind of, men and women are different. We say that a lot on the show, where we're different. And I think it still comes from a conscious knowledge of how we are different. And even though we're different as men and women, but we are also different in the forms of people, just being who you are regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, just your personality. And when you mentioned this, when we started talking about this, I thought about the private side of it. And when I initially thought about it, I think that was something that when we first started dating and started going out and getting to know each other, I was very private. And we're going to talk about that. So go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, it's okay. And I think a part of, like I was saying, being private, we all need privacy. But when you're private to the point where what goes on in my house stays in my house, I think that culturally, we as brown people of color, we tend to be a little bit more private in how we even deal with pain and grief and difficulty. And so as a result of that, we limit our ability to really get outside help because of our desire to be private.
You know, I think part of it is the understanding that when you're in the beginning of your relationship, we like to call it the honeymoon stage, of course you're going to be private. There's going to be things that you don't want to share when you're very first starting out in a relationship, because sometimes it can be too much.
Well, and a part of it, there has to be trust that is built that allows you to let some of those walls down.
Right.
But it's when you've been together with someone for years and you're still private, or when you're governed by being prideful, or when you're proud. And so as you and I were talking about this, we were talking about which one of those that you struggle more with. Are you more private? Are you more prideful? Or are you more proud? And I know that we were both talking about that. And I would say for me, I am not a private person by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a very open person. That's just me. That's how I am. And that could be good and bad. But the thing that I struggle with, and I have to really constantly be mindful of, is being proud. I got it. I don't need help. I'm all right. I'm okay. You know, and there's reasons why. There's nothing wrong with being proud of someone or proud of an accomplishment. But when I'm talking about being proud, I'm talking about not being willing to let people help you, not being willing to let people see that you need them. And so I would have to say that's something that I have to be mindful of, is not feeling like, and everything goes back to childhood of origin. Again, I'm the oldest child. I'm I'm a female. I was born in a home where parents were not necessarily the most responsible. So all those things play into your why. But at the end of the day, you still are responsible for how you manage and how you navigate what you go through growing up. And so it doesn't explain it. It doesn't excuse it, but it explains it.
Right. And before we go into some of the things that we discovered about ourselves, let's go back to private.
Yes.
Because the way we started out the show, we want to give our listeners and all those who listen, we thank you for coming in and checking in with us every week and just sharing and just listening.
And hanging out with us.
Right. And so let's talk about the private side first, though, to give people an understanding. When we say we're talking about being private from a marriage or relational standpoint,
right?
Let's dive into that one.
Well, let's give some examples. No, you cannot look at my cell phone.
Wait, those are examples of the exercise of private.
Yes.
For me, and I would say lean towards introversion, naturally introverted, very reserved. So somebody who's private, that's naturally, I think, one of the things that they would tend to be is kind of reserved in how they approach things and approach their relationships. So asking to see my cell phone, is that kind of jumping over into the deep end? Are we talking about at the very beginning of our relationship?
Well, I'm just saying those are just some of the ways that people express or feel their privacy is being violated. And so a person who is private is less likely to give you access to things that they deem personal.
Right. So why would somebody be private, would you say, based on what you have observed?
Well, I think that there's a time and a place for everything, but we're talking about these things combined together or in excess, because we do need, like I said, we do need a certain level of privacy. But when we are allowing privacy to keep us from connecting, keep us from getting closer, then it becomes something that is unhealthy. And so it's just a matter of understanding that, especially when you're trying to go through and get help. Let's just say you're struggling with something. There is a certain level of
vulnerability or openness.
Because we're going to also talk about at the end, what are the things that neutralize these three. But a part of it is just there are certain things that we have kind of learned that when you're working with couples or just when you're just in relationships, period, there are certain things that make relationships a little bit more challenging. And we talked about it in the last episode. Thaddeus and Amanda were talking about how in the military, we make friends fast and we get open fast because we know we don't have a lot of time and sometimes we're overseas. And so I think that there are different groups of people that have less trouble with being extremely private. And especially not with you, especially with your job and just identity. We're not talking about those type of things. We're just talking about things that are just a matter of basically it's making you guarded.
Right. And that's one of the things I was kind of going towards was why would somebody be in a private type, as far as from their perspective of them saying, I'm a private person. I think it comes from the couples we've talked to and things that they've shared with us. I think it all kind of stems from, you mentioned it already, origin issues of childhood and those things. But I think they operate out of a position of hurt, where the reason why I'm private is because I was hurt by A, B, C, D, or whatever it was. So now I had to go into kind of a protection mode.
It's a defense mechanism.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. They are protecting themselves. So that privacy that they're guarded or holding on to from opening up to whoever they are.
And it's a form of control.
Oh, elaborate on that one now.
Well, if you think about it, if I see that you want to get close to me, a way to keep me from getting hurt is by not allowing you to. So privacy can also be a control mechanism. Well, or to use the excuse, well, I'm just private. I just don't share things like that. And I think about even as a believer, when people say, well, my relationship with God is private. It's like, it can be personal.
Right.
But some things, especially something like that, it shouldn't be private. It should be something that people who are in need of it have access to it, especially your relationship with God. So there's ways that, so all these words have by themselves are fine. It's when you combine them and it becomes like a wall. That's when it becomes a problem. That's what we're talking about in regards to relationships. The 3 Ps can cause a lot of problems in marriage and dating relationships because they begin to keep people out and it keeps you from getting close and it keeps you from connecting.
And that's going to be very difficult for you to grow. You know, when you're in a relationship and you're been in it for a little while or even a short amount of time where you want to start opening up and removing some of those privacy boundaries, if you want to call it that, where now all of a sudden you're in a position to where you're going to kind of expose yourself and some of the things that are inner, you know, very close to you.
And, you know, I think about when we first got married, I just think about how open you were to, like, we've never had where we have each other's phone codes, we have each other's bank information, we have each other. I think about when you left and you gave me access to all of your letters and all those things that you had. So I think that in a marriage relationship, in order for it to be healthy, I think that the sooner you learn to be open and not be guarded, the easier it is for you to grow close to that person and to connect. And so these are just some of the things that we have realized, that when couples are struggling, one or all three of these things are always common, and they're always evident. And so if you can be mindful of this when you're dating, when you're engaged, it sets you up for success versus having these 3 P's looming in your relationship and you not being aware that it's a problem.
Because when you're starting out in your relationship, you're expected to be private to a certain extent because you're just learning, you're just getting to know a person. But over time, if that privacy is still there, you may want to look at, did this person hurt me, or am I operating out of a history or a past hurt and kind of pulling it into my present that is kind of preventing me from dropping that privacy boundary, so to speak, with the person that I'm in this relationship with.
Yeah. And it's funny because I think about being private. I think about as a couple, we have this show we binge watch because we love human behavior, and they're talking about using the bathroom. You know, if I'm brushing my teeth or if I'm taking a shower and you have to use the bathroom. Those are things that each couple has to navigate to what level they feel comfortable with. And so privacy is not what we're talking about. We're talking about being private.
Internally. Yeah.
When you have these inner vows, or I'll never share this, I'll never. So along with the private, it is a way to keep people out. And so what we're saying is we want to kind of equip all of us, as well as the people in our community, to not fall prey to some of the old habits that we may have brought into our relationships. And sometimes we culturally feel like certain things are okay, but when you look at the big scheme of things of the recipe for people who have healthy relationships, these 3 P's cannot be a part of your everyday life.
So that was P number 1.
P number 1.
And now we're going to talk about P number 2, which you said you kind of identified with a little bit.
I proud.
And I love, and when we were talking about this and just kind of preparing for the show, James chapter 4 came up. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And while that's how you combat this, and we're going to talk about that later on after we go through the other 2, but that was just something that came up when we were preparing for the episode was, wow, so that's what that's talking about. You know, when you're in a position of being proud, that's not good.
No.
But it depends on how you can be proud of certain things that you've done and accomplishments and things like that. But there's something that you do when it pertains to being proud that can be a problem.
Yeah.
And you kind of mentioned it a little bit. Go ahead.
Because a part of it is understanding that we all have growth areas and strengths. And so when we're afraid to let people help us or to acknowledge the things about us that are not the best, or even be told, another thing about being proud is people who are proud have a hard time being corrected. They have a hard time accepting someone else's input or someone else's way of doing things. And so those are all the ways that being proud can really hurt you in a relationship, because a part of what makes relationships really beneficial is that I see something in you that I need, and I can share how I admire that, and vice versa.
You know, it says when you have a high degree, an excessive high opinion of yourself and your own self-importance, that's the kind of proud that we're talking about. When you're kind of feeling yourself a little bit too much.
And another
maybe?
thing about being proud, it still stems from the same thing. It still stems from having been hurt and not trusting. So you feel like, well, I got this, I can do it myself. And a part of what we always talk about is understanding that we have to begin to love like we've not been hurt. Mm-hmm. We have to begin to navigate relationships based on that day and that individual, and not bring everybody along the road of where we've been hurt before. And so what's helped me is to realize that anything that God has called us to do that's going to be meaningful is going to require us to have other people help us, and it's going to require for us to help other people.
Right. And
we need each other.
And there's nothing wrong. And we want to kind of be open and clear about that, because you should have pride in yourself and pride in what you do and those types of things. We're talking about when you're operating from a position of pride where it actually is an irrational thought and ideal and principle about how you feel, not just about yourself, but comparing in comparison to other people, that can become very, very difficult.
Yes.
You know, you have an idea of my own self-importance and my value towards me as an individual, and the things that I'm doing is better than what you're doing. A lot of times when you think about, when we're talking about being proud, we're talking about being in comparison to someone else. You know, that comparison trap can be very, very hazardous for you in the long run. So that's when we're talking about pride.
And the Bible talks about not being puffed up and not being haughty. And so a part of it is understanding that everything that God designed every coin has two sides.
Right.
And so we have to be mindful that it's good to be driven and it's good to be a self-starter, but it's also good to realize that we need each other and we need help. And we have to be able to be willing to say, hey, I'm not good at this. Can you help me?
And why do you think people have such a hard time with saying, I need help?
Well, it comes from being disappointed, you know, and sometimes it comes from being a perfectionist. It comes from feeling like, well, you know what? I can do it a lot faster. I think about when the kids were little and I was trying to teach them how to make up the bed. I was like, well, I can do that so much faster than them. But that's not helping them learn.
Right.
So just because you can do something faster or you can do something better or you can do it by yourself, it's just a matter of what helps us to grow is learning from each other. What helps us to grow is being in relationships. And you can't do that if you don't learn how to share the responsibility of whatever needs to be done with other people.
Right. And we're talking about the 3 Ps. We already covered private.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about being proud. But before we go on to the third one, we wanted to just take some opportunity and some time to say thank you to all of our guests and people who have kind of helped us out during these episodes and the things that we've done with the Rich Relationship Podcast. We are at episode 60.
That's such an amazing accomplishment.
And it is, and it's been fun. And this is something that we wanted to just share with everyone, that we've decided that this is going to be the end of season 2.
Yes.
You know, based on all the episodes that we recorded and the time frames and things like that. So we are kind of deciding that we're going to be doing 30 episode blocks, so to speak. So we're not going to be in sync with the calendar like some people do. And maybe we may adjust that, but we are going to be starting. We've been kind of looking at and talking about new content that we're putting together and some new things that we're going to be doing with the episodes.
Like our weekly Facebook Live for our community.
You can go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Yes. So we are starting season 3 of the Rich Relationship Podcast. And as a result of that, because we have so many couples that we're helping and reaching out to, we wanted to find a way to allow us to be multiple places at one time.
And this pandemic that has been forcing a lot of people to kind of think outside the box.
To do some things different. And so we're going to be doing a weekly Facebook Live on my page, Renee M. Beavers, which if you're not a friend, please go and give us a friend request. But we are going to be doing a weekly Facebook Live. We're calling it the Rich Relationship Refuge. It's a couples getaway. So once a week at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time, we'll be on Facebook Live, and we'll also put it on our Rich Relationships page as well. But we're going to be doing this every week because we want to be able to find a way to connect with you, to get to know you, to be available to you. And so that's a way for us to do that. And we're really excited about seeing you guys all on Facebook Live.
And I think a lot of times, people want to see us behind the voices.
Yes.
And while that's not something or at least I,
one of us,
that's not something that I had really strived to do, but I understand that people we're in a visual age now, and I understand that, and I have no problem with that. So we actually get to see each other face to face for a change, which is be great, and we're excited about it, and we're thankful for it. And we also want to thank everyone for the book is getting ready to be dropped here. It's coming up soon.
We're coming along right along on schedule, and we want to thank everyone who's following us on Instagram. We reached over 10,000 followers. We are excited and ecstatic. Thank you for following us. We are so excited about our YouTube channel. It's growing, and we're excited about just better ways to serve you. How can we serve you? Send us an email. Give us a call at 404-936-1642. Let us know how we can serve you. We are so grateful and so honored to be able to serve you in this capacity. And we just want to thank God for the gift of the Rich Relationship Podcast. And the best part of it is you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate y'all.
Gil and Renee Beaver's over 30-year relationship is the genesis for the Rich Relationship Podcast, which is designed to empower individuals with the tools, principles, and the community needed to unpack ourselves, our past, and our preconceived notions associated with relationships.
Let's get empty and grow together so that our lives will be filled with love and healthy, rich relationships. Now let's go into our show.
So we are talking about the 3 Ps. We already covered being private, and we talked a little about being proud. Now we're going to talk about, I think it's the biggest one, which is the pride aspect.
Being prideful.
And this one, and I even flubbed a little bit while we were talking about pride, and I said proud, and I said pride, because they are so closely synonymous with each other in kind of identity and essence. So we're going to talk a little bit more about being
prideful. And that's the difference between being proud and being prideful. And Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall. God's word ensures us pride is the root of and the ruin of our lives.
Right.
And so it's just important that we understand that being prideful is not a good thing. Mm-hmm. Pride, you can have pride in your
and that's just basically
heritage. You can have pride in your
who you are,
being in the military. I mean, there's things you can have pride in your children, but when you're prideful, it's the root and it's the beginning of the fall, and it's one of the things we can say we have noticed with couples when they are really having a hard time, it's because pride has got in and made people say things and do things that they regret. And rather than owning it and accepting responsibility for it, it's really easy to, as we talked about in one of the other episodes, bring out the blame thrower. And normally when people walk in pride, they are very quick to blame, deflect, to project, and to make the other person feel. I remember when I was dating, when I was in my teens, I was dating this guy, and it seemed like no matter what happened, everything was always my fault.
Right.
It's like, wait a minute, you just flipped that around where you were wrong, and now I feel like, and now I'm not talking about Gil, y'all. I'm talking about my first boyfriend when I was...
All them knuckleheads. That's okay.
Yeah, it wasn't that many of them, but they were knuckleheads. That's why they're not my husband.
And because we're talking about someone who was actually comparing their strengths to, in that essence, your weaknesses.
Right.
You know, where if you're in that position where it's easy to see the shortcomings in our spouses and our significant others. We don't even have to work at that.
No,
we can see that it's easy. Mm-hmm. I'm not here to say that it doesn't exist, because we all know it does.
Yeah.
But it's when you are in a position where you're kind of emphasizing it and talking about, well,
in order to make yourself big, you make someone else small.
Right. And especially if you think about if you're doing that with your spouse, that's probably going to be a big problem if it hasn't reared its head yet. It's coming, you know, and you don't
if you think about it, if that's the seeds you're planting, they're going to grow and become a harvest of regret.
Right. And that's the essence of someone who is prideful, or essence of being pride and exercising, walking in that, is when you're comparing your strengths to someone else's weaknesses constantly. It can be your spouse, it can be a friend, it can be a coworker, or even if you've driven down the street and you see that person on the side of the road and you say something like, I'm not as bad as that, or you start critiquing their life based on a snapshot of someone's situation, and you're comparing your life to theirs.
Yeah.
That's somebody who has a big thing in pride. And I love the way Galatians in chapter 6 and verses 4 and 5, it basically, and I'm paraphrasing a little, you can go check it out. It talks about, and it's one of my favorite books, and because it's in your face.
Yeah.
And it says, pay attention to your own work. Your satisfaction comes from that. Don't worry or be comparing yourself to others. Think of yourself and be responsible for your own conduct.
Which means worry about yourself.
Right. And
weighs it.
and that's so challenging because it's easy to, like I said, be focused on others around you and not look at yourself.
Yeah. And if you think about it, though, it's because we were talking about it before about it's so important to really know you and to know your own growth areas and to know your own areas where you need to change. But most people, it goes back to the scripture in Matthew, remove the plank from your own eye before you remove the splinter. And the Lord, I've shared before, the Lord just showed me, if you will focus on you and not focus on someone else, because we only have self-control. So if I'm focusing on what is wrong with you or what is your growth area, how is that productive? And so pride puts us in a position where we focus so much on what others aren't doing or what others need to do that we become totally oblivious to the areas where we need to grow and change.
Right. And you even already mentioned it. We were talking about the types of pride. You have that outward where I'm looking at other people and I'm critiquing other people and feeling a little bit superior over them or how I view myself in comparison to them. And the type we are talking about is the inward. That's the one that we should be exercising. That's the one Galatians is talking about, and how you just put it, where you got to be looking at yourself.
Yeah. And it to me, for me, it has made life so much more enjoyable, and it's made my life so much less stressful by focusing on my growth areas and the strengths in others. It makes your relationships a place where people want to come. We talk about like a store. What kind of store do you have? If you have a store where you're private and you're prideful and you're proud, those are the stores that close down because they're not getting as much patronage, because people don't go where they don't feel loved and encouraged and accepted.
And I love the way, you remember the book, The Chronicles of Narnia?
Yeah.
That we looked at C.S. Lewis as a great theologian and those things. Yeah. And I love the way he put it. As long as I'm looking down on someone, I can't see something that is above me.
Wow. That's beautiful.
So when I read that, I was like, ooh, okay. So if I am focusing on people who I perceive is below me, then I can't see, or I'm preventing myself from looking up to my Father in heaven, who I should be looking forward or looking up to. And that's something that just impacted me when I read that. And I was like, wow.
And I remember when the Lord started showing me about how I always compare myself to my mom. And he said, you're comparing yourself to her, but I am far higher than her. So when you make God the standard and not another person, it sets you up to constantly be in constant renovation. We're all under construction. We should all be always trying to be growing and changing. And so that's, so what we want to talk about now is, what are some of how do you neutralize the 3 Ps?
And before you mention that, I just want to make this last point about kind of a self-check when it comes to pride. When you compare yourselves, I think we've all done it at one point or another. I think it's a natural thing to compare ourselves to those around us or in our lives. But you ever notice that we never compare ourselves to someone doing better than us in a particular area? We always tend to identify with somebody who's just a little bit below where we're at, whether it's to make ourselves feel better about it.
And I think that's what pride does. Pride gives you a false sense of who you are. And so when you begin to operate in and maneuver in that arena, it becomes it's a form of self-exaltation. It's that I'm good and you're not. And it's what got the enemy kicked out of heaven. He wanted to be above God. And so I think that the desire to be over people can only set you up for a downward spiral. Nothing positive can come from
that. And that was just something that I wanted to make a point of, because if you're comparing yourself compare yourself to somebody that's doing a little bit better.
Yeah, God.
Yeah.
Make the Lord your standard. Let him be who we strive to be like. Not a person on television and not your neighbor, not a person in your workplace. Let the Lord be the gauge for how
the standard
and who we should be. He should be the standard.
Now you wanted to talk about, we mentioned it earlier a little bit about how do we
neutralize it? What do we do? How do we get these 3 P's
in check?
How do we get them out of our life, or the throne of our heart? And I love how when the Bible says when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Lord rages the standard. God is the flood, not the enemy. So the way that you overcome something like the 3 P's, the first thing would be, which is one of the most beautiful gifts that God gave us, is humility.
Yes.
When we begin to walk in humility, when we begin to allow the fruits of the Spirit, love and joy and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and meekness and self-control, to govern our lives, humility, though I believe that all those things humility is the fruit of that. And so when we begin to walk in humility, it gets rid of us being prideful. So the opposite of being prideful is being humble, and in order not to be proud, you have to be humble.
Right.
And so I just think that, when we allow humility and when we allow the things that God created for us, it makes our life a lot better.
And the way you can do that in a practical application way is the first, don't think about yourself and the strengths that you have. And when you compare them to yourself, focus on your own growth areas.
Yeah.
The things that you are challenged with, the things that you know you need to work on, because nobody can tell you more than you can tell yourself. They can make you aware of certain things,
right,
things that you are could work on. Mm-hmm. But I really believe at the essence of who we are, we know what our growth areas are.
And I really believe the people who really care about you, and I just believe the way God works is that God is going to tell you on the inside what needs to grow and change. And then he's going to send somebody alongside you to remind you of that. So people aren't going to tell you something you don't know. They may just remind you of that. And then when you don't listen to the external confirmation, then God has to send consequences. So I just believe that whenever God tells me something and then somebody else comes and confirms it, I'm like, because next is going to be tribulation. So let me just do what he asked me to do.
Yeah. And then the second part of that is don't compare yourself to other people.
Yeah.
Because it can have the opposite effect. Mm-hmm. If I start comparing myself with someone else, I'm never going to be good enough.
Yeah.
I'm never going to accomplish what they've accomplished. And I think that can be one of those essence of low self-esteem that people exercise or have as they grow up, because nobody is born with low self-esteem.
No, we all come here 100%. Babies, you show you that. Yeah. Me. They know that they're everything. And it's something that happens in our life that takes away from that. But we come here fully aware of our greatness and our importance. And if you don't believe it, watch a baby.
Because you don't want to be tearing yourself down.
No.
So that means you just want to have a healthy, sober position about things that you need to work on, things that you need to grow in and get better at, and also have a good idea of how you are as a person. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a good, sober, balanced idea of how you are as a person, I believe your spouse or your significant other can help you identify some of those things if you ask.
Right.
But sometimes we don't ask because maybe we really don't want to know.
Right.
Or we don't want that confirmation that, I kind of knew I needed to be less angry about something or more vocal about something, or talk about my emotions and how I feel and get out of my own way sometimes. Yeah. But if we do that, we're going to find that humility becomes easier and easier, and we become more and more humble in our life.
And then the other superpower is to be vulnerable.
That's a scary one for a lot of people.
Vulnerable, y'all. We have to be humble and vulnerable.
Going a little bit into that about being vulnerable.
Because see, a lot of times, and we talk about, because I'm like, if we could only talk about 3 topics, and when we work with couples and when we get asked to come out and speak, we talk about 3 topics. We talk about communication. No, we talk about identity, communication, and intimacy. Well, most people don't understand that they lack intimacy because they lack vulnerability.
And they can't communicate.
Yes. Well, a part of being vulnerable, you really can only be vulnerable. You can be vulnerable physically, but vulnerability requires communication.
Which means the thing that we were just talking about, if you know what your growth areas are, you have to be honest with that person to bring them up,
Yes.
to expose yourself,
Yes.
to identify with them. Hey, this is where I'm weak at. I say it all the time, and I share with people, I am weak.
Yeah.
And when you know what your weak areas, or we call them growth areas, substitute weak for growth, because you can't grow.
Right.
But be aware of those and then share them with other people. You'll be surprised at how it's going to be freeing for you, but also very helpful for them, because they probably are struggling with the same things.
And that's what I said. We are so much more alike than we are different. These are things that everyone goes through and everyone struggles with. And so being vulnerable is really a superpower.
But it's also scary. We understand that.
And a part of the reason why it can be scary is because we get good at what we practice.
Right.
And so when you practice being private and when you practice being proud, being vulnerable is at the other end of the spectrum. And that's what I love about God, is that he says you will know the truth and it'll set you free. That light has no business with darkness. And so there are stark differences. And so if you're at this end of the spectrum, it's going to look very scary because it's so far away.
And you're not familiar with it.
And the closer you get to it, the more it becomes familiar. And so to me, when I look at being proud and I look at being private, I look at being proud, those seem scary to me because I know what they can bring. So it's just a matter of you positioning yourself in a place to become more like Christ, and not that you're ever going to be perfect, because that's not the goal. The goal is to always be working to grow and change. What being vulnerable is not when you tell people the truth about everything about themselves. That's not being vulnerable. That's being a busybody. Being vulnerable is telling the truth about yourself. Being aware of and sharing. This is something that, what are you afraid of? These are some of my fears. These are some of the things I'm concerned about. That's what being vulnerable is. And the more vulnerable you are with yourself and with God, the easier it is for you to do that with your spouse.
The one caveat that I'll add to that is you only want to be vulnerable with people that you have a trust and a safe place and familiarity
Right.
with. It'd be a little weird for you to just start opening up to a perfect.
That means you have boundary issues when you do that.
You may want to just be a little
oversharing.
You may want to know who your safe people are.
And we're talking about in the premise of this, we're talking about with your spouse or someone
significant other, your
you're
fiance, or
engaged
somebody,
to.
right.
And so but again, we do meet people who we walk into a room and they just start telling us all of their deep, dark secrets. I don't know if that's something about the way God wired us or it's just the way we are. To be vulnerable, there has to be this thing called trust.
Yes, that's an essence of all those relationships.
Yes, unless you have childhood of origin issues, because when you have childhood of origin issues, you can be vulnerable with everyone, and that can be very dangerous.
Right.
And so we have to learn. And something else I'll share, sidebar, that the Lord really showed me about boundaries. I always thought of a boundary as a way to keep people out, but a boundary is a way to keep me in. It's an inward swinging door. So when I look at a boundary as maybe I'm doing too much, maybe I'm giving too much, maybe I'm saying too much, it makes it more about what I need to do to control myself versus me trying to control someone else. And that just helped me, because for me, I have a very extroverted, outgoing, verbal, opinionated personality.
Right.
And so I think that all of these are things that God is teaching me how to navigate the way he wired me so that I can go into any environment and be a blessing and not a cursing.
Right. So all the episodes that we've done, if you kind of really have listened to us and you've noticed, it's kind of a common thread that we're always talking about yourself and knowing yourself and being, like we mentioned already, about identity. Know who you are.
Yeah.
The things that you are struggling with or that are growth areas for you, we are here to help you. That's why we put out these episodes, and we want to help you. And so that's why we will continue to put them out, because with those things, we always say we're going to be stronger together. But that's what we desire for everyone that is listening, that we bring things to your attention to be aware of.
Right.
Whether it's being private and proud and prideful, like we talked about, but also going into exercising some humility.
Yeah. And vulnerability.
Because that's how you combat those things and become better at being who you are as a person.
Yeah. And you become a place where people want to come.
And that's
you become a relationship that people value.
Right.
And that's what makes relationships worth investing in.
Because remember, guys, we are stronger together, and we will see you on season 3
of the Rich Relationship Podcast with Rigel and Renee. Let's grow.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for your investment in time. Remember to subscribe to the show and hit the notification icon to be notified when new episodes are posted on the podcast platform that you're listening from.
Or you can always find us on our website at richrelationshipsus.com or our YouTube channel, Rich Relationship with Gil and Renee. If you found this podcast helpful or you think it could help someone that you know and care about, please pass it along and share it with them.
And also, you can always send your questions and comments to richrelationships.us@gmail.com. This is a weekly podcast, and the new episodes are going to be posted on Monday by 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. Remember, we're stronger together.
Let's grow.